Okay, in this tutorial we're going to look at the human and natural causes of land degradation. So what we're effectively looking at is the idea that both human activity as well as natural processes can contribute to the loss of soil or useful soil through a range of different erosive processes. So let's start by looking at human activity or the human causes. So the first one I've got an image of is the idea that overcultivation of the soil can lead to soil erosion. So what happens with overcultivation is the continual planting of crops without any time for the soil to rest leads to the withdrawal of nutrients and the gradual breaking down of the soil structure as it loses its nutrients and the things that it uses to feed the plants are absorbed by the plants, which are then harvested, but then are not returned to the soil. Traditionally, in European countries, farmers would rotate their crops and leave areas of land fallow for at least one season or a year. But in sub-Saharan Africa, because of population pressure and the requirements of farmers to get as much from the land as they can just to survive, they're often planting a couple of crops a year with very little time in between for the soil to actually build up its nutrients and especially its nitrogen. So that's overcultivation. A linked idea is the planting of monocultures. So what we can see here in this field is a farmer is planting tobacco, and in this field he'll be planting tobacco every single year. There'll be no other crop going into that. So there's obviously a link between the plant that grows in the soil and the chemistry of that soil. So if you use a range of different plants, or what we call intercropping, in a field, then over time you'll build up the variety of nutrients that are found in that soil, or if you at least rotate them from one crop to another every single year. However, if you just plant the same crop all the time, especially something like tobacco, which actually gives very little to the soil that's positive, then over time the soil will degrade and lose its structure and eventually die. Right, so that's the idea of overcultivation and monoculture. That's the first of the main human causes. Let's have a look at the second cause. So part of the farming process, so this is linked to the previous idea, is the fact that farmers increasingly are becoming more and more dependent on chemical fertilizers and pesticides. Now, the idea of using fertilizers is obviously to enhance the growth of your crop, but often as the soil starts to degrade, sometimes because of what is happening in this first photo, then the farmer starts to use chemical interventions to try to maintain the growth of their crops. This becomes a problem, though, because year on year the soil gets worse, so more fertilizers have to be used until eventually the soil becomes completely dependent on these chemical interventions. But what the fertilizers do, alongside the pesticides, which are obviously used to kill bugs that might kill the plants, is they kill all the natural organisms in the soil, and those organisms, those bacteria and worms and all the other microorganisms that inhabit the soil, are killed off by these artificial chemicals, and that therefore weakens the structure of the soil and once again leads to soil degradation. Okay, our third idea, and probably often the one most commonly written about, and one of the most significant causes of land degradation, and especially soil erosion that comes with land degradation, is the deforestation of the forested areas of the Sahel. So obviously deforestation occurs for a number of reasons. Population pressure results in people cutting down trees for fuel wood. So that's a very common reason to remove the forestry layer. It also, forestry is removed by grazing animals that eat and strip the bark off the trees and kill the trees. So overgrazing of goat herds and things like that, for example, can lead to an area becoming deforested. But also in many parts of the world, even in the Sahel, deforestation also occurs because farmers are clearing the land for crop growing, which we can see in the first two photos. So the trees are removed in the first place to allow the land to be cultivated, and especially to allow machines to be brought in. Now, what happens when you deforest a landscape is you remove the natural protection of the soil from the rain. We'll talk more about that later on. And you also remove the protection that trees give the soil from wind erosion. Trees also, furthermore, add their leaf foliage, which fall to the ground and decompose and add to the nutrients in the soil. So if you don't have trees, then they're not feeding the soil that way. Likewise, their roots also help fix carbon in the soil, as well as binding the soil together, especially holding it together when there's periods of heavy rain. So removing trees will increase the natural processes, which we're going to talk about in a second. Right, the fourth effect, human effect, is the trampling effect. So this is where farmers have large herds of animals grazing the land. So there's two things happen here. Firstly, the uncontrolled grazing removes the grass cover, and obviously these are plants which have root systems that bind the soil, and these animals are tearing the grass up and therefore destroying the plant that's helping bind the soil. But their hooves are also trampling and compacting the soil. And what this does is it minimizes the effect of water naturally flowing through the soil and infiltrating, and effectively causes water to run on the surface, leading to surface erosion. Okay, and our final effect is a much larger cause, and it's not necessarily through farming practices, but it's much broader than that, and that's to do with climate change. So the role that climate change has is that, firstly, climate change is disrupting rainfall patterns. Now, we can see in this rainfall chart from the Sahel in Africa that rainfall patterns, obviously year on year, are very variable. As we can see, sometimes we have a wet year like we have around about 1908, followed by a very dry, relatively dry year the year after. And the pattern is very variable across the first kind of 60 years of the 20th century. By the time we get to the 1970s, you can see that almost every single year, compared to the overall mean, which is this line here, is below that average long-term mean. So since the 1970s, the Sahel has had a prolonged period of drought, which is being blamed on changes in the ITCZ, which is the large weather pattern in West Africa. And that's been disrupted because of changes in surface ocean temperatures caused by climate change. So we have a gradual drying happening in the Sahel that's been going on for about 40 years now. And that's been combined with rising temperatures. So here we can see the average temperature in the Sahel from 1970. So this coincides with the drought period. So we can see the temperatures were ranging below an average seasonal temperature of 30 degrees, and now it's at 31. So we've got at least 1 degree warmer Sahel over the last 40 years. So drier weather and hotter weather is leading to the soil drying up, which is intensifying the natural processes of wind erosion. Okay, so I've just reviewed 5 of the key human causes, describing the cause and then explaining its role in leading to the soil eroding. Let's now think about how that combines with natural processes. So nature will always naturally attack the soil, and depending on how humans are using the land in an area will depend on how impactful these processes are. So let's first of all start with wind erosion. So wind erosion can happen in one of kind of 3 classic ways. And it's really to do with the weight of the particles that are being loosened up. So the first thing we have to understand about wind erosion is the wind erosion is going to be far more intense in an area that has got very little forest cover. So the trees would naturally act as barriers to the wind and break the wind patterns up. Trees would also collect the soil as it was blowing. So if you've deforested an area, then wind erosion is going to be intensified. A drier area will also have baked the land, loosening the soil up, making it more likely to be able to blow when the wind is picking up. Okay, so these are just a couple of factors that are going to mean that your wind erosion is more likely to happen. So let's have a look at the 3 kind of key things that make up wind erosion. So you've got a strong wind in a deforested area where it's very hot and dry and the soil's been loosened up. And the first one is going to be suspension. So these are the smallest particles that are literally picked up by the wind and blown in the air. And we can see here these suspended particles in this dust cloud that's blowing across the Sahel. So these are billions of small particles of sand that are being held in suspension. They're literally being suspended. And this is soil effectively blowing in the air, and it can be blown hundreds, in some cases, thousands of miles. There's dust or soil that's actually landing in South America, in the Amazon basin, that's come from Africa, that's been blown the whole way across the Atlantic Ocean, held in suspension in these mighty dust storms. So that's the first process. That's the smallest particles being picked up by the wind and blown. The second type is saltation, and it's the most common, and you'd feel this if you were down at ground level. So this is where larger particles, sand particles, for example, are moving along the ground. They're jumping and they're bouncing and they're rolling, but they're never getting airborne like the suspended particles. So that is saltation. And the final one is the largest particles, which are too large to be picked up by the air, and they move along the ground, and this is called surface creep. You can see these particles here. It tends to be a much slower movement compared to the other two, as they roll and slide across the ground. And generally after a dust storm, these are the particles that you're most likely to see scattered across the landscape, whereas the smaller ones, especially the ones suspended in the atmosphere, will have blown away. So there's how the wind can contribute to the soil erosion. And you've got to obviously link it back to why it's going to be worse, and that's to do with human activity. Let's have a look at 4 processes of water erosion. So the first and one of the most common is rain splash. So this is where raindrops coming in through the atmosphere impact on the ground. Now, if there's no vegetation coverage, if there's no trees there to intercept that rainfall, then the rain will directly impact on the soil. And if the soil has already been dried out due to a dry period that might have been the previous month, then the raindrop is going to literally kick up a little dust cloud every time it hits the soil, okay? And it's going to dislodge that soil, and that dislodged soil will now be more likely to move either with rain across the surface, rainwater, or it might be transported when it dries out by the wind and carried to another location. So rain splash is where the raindrops are dislodging the soil and moving it outwards from its original location. And if it's on a slope, then it's going to start moving down the slope. Okay. Our next type of water erosion I've put these two together. So we've got sheet erosion and we've got rill erosion. Now here we can see sheet erosion, where rainwater has fallen onto this field and it's washed away apart a couple of centimeters of the soil all the way down to the base here. So the soil will be collecting down here and probably flowing into a river and being carried away to the ocean. So sheet erosion is where the surface topsoil is actually removed, and it generally happens during a period of severe rainfall. Now, when that starts to happen and you've removed the surface layer, now the next time it rains, the water is going to naturally gather in this small channel that's formed. And that's going to end up creating something like this, which is rill erosion. That's R-I-L-L, as you can see there. Now this is where, just similar to sheet erosion, it's when you get a period of heavy rain, you can actually get a water channel being eroded away that's going to eventually form, in this case, a large gully. And every time it rains, all of the soil from up here is going to be washed into here, and this is going to become a raging torrent of water, carrying more and more soil away. So it's just going to get worse over time. And the final one is a process introduced in the biosphere topic, which is intensified in a deforested landscape, and it's leaching. Now, leaching is going to be more significant during a period of heavy rainfall, because all the nutrients in the A horizon are going to be washed down to the B and into the C, and then moved deep underground away from that location. And of course, leaching is where you're losing all your minerals and your nutrients that are in your A and your B horizon, because they're getting washed down. Now, this is going to be more intensified if you've deforested your landscape and there are no longer any root systems to absorb some of that water and to pick up those nutrients. So if you've cut them down, then your leaching is going to be more pronounced during a period of heavy rain. Okay, so now you've seen the connection between man-made factors and how we can contribute to the destruction or degradation of soil, and how those interact with natural factors to do with water and rain.